All right, everyone. It's 4 p.m. UTC, and here we go again for a new webinar here on the TMS Web Academy. And I'm very honored today to have our speaker, Neil Laskowski, a guest speaker who will speak about his product, the Runtime Toolkit, and its various parts that are in this Runtime Toolkit, and which also uses several FNC components. So Neil, welcome to this webinar. And can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity to present to everybody on the line, and hope this is educational for everybody that's on.
As a way of introduction, Neil, I was very surprised that you only took up Delphi development starting from Berlin 10.1. So that's maybe I guess only about 5 years ago. That's right.
Yeah, 5-6 years ago at this point. So I'm a very young Delphi person.
Indeed.
But I do come from a Java C# background, and I did many years with Oracle PL/SQL. So I can't say that I'm unfamiliar with the PL part of it.
But in these years, I think it has been a quite impressive route to this to where you are right now, taking up so many development challenges, including, as you have used FNC, also cross-platform development.
You know, Delphi is fun. Delphi is hard. It's an exciting product to be able to use because, yes, you can go cross-platform with it. And, you know, what I started with was an accountant came to me with a financial calculator and said, I want it on my Mac, and said, can you do it? And I looked at the product and I downloaded the demo and played with it a little bit. And I said, yeah, you know, if you have some patience, I'll work with you. And it was a traditional route, porting a VCL app over to FMX, which was not easy. But, you know, there's a lot of resources out here to help new Delphi developers. And, you know, luckily there's some really good components. Obviously, I'm a little bit partial to FNC because it's what I've used for a few years. And yeah, I think it's an exciting time.
In these 5-6 years of taking up Delphi, what would you indicate as the things you specifically like about, let's say, everything in connection with Delphi?
Well, I mean, overall, I have to say, look, I like the IDE. It's got its pain points, but, you know, it is quick, and, you know, you deal with a few glitches. But really, to me, the reason I didn't go back to C# for the customer that I helped out is, you know, the components are very high quality in the Delphi space compared to what you get with some of the components in C#. So really, there's a certain level of maturity with the components that you get to choose from, even on the FMX side, given that they're pretty new. You know, in my opinion, FNC is a great product because when I look at it, it's y'all kind of took the best world of your VCL pack and ported it over to FMX. That makes it real easy to pick up development because you're literally just assigning what you know needs to get assigned, and the layout is pretty straightforward. So, you know, there's a lot of other great projects out there. I just haven't had the chance to play with them. And you know, you hear the word full stack thrown around a lot, but these days the stack is so big. I don't know that there are very many people who have a brain to hold the full stack anymore, just because it's huge.
That's very true, and I can very much relate to that. Definitely, having been working with Turbo Pascal since '86, and what you had to know to do a lot of things in '86 compared to what you have to know today to do things, it's just a huge difference. That indeed. But Neil, we are here to talk about the Runtime Toolkit, which is a tool I think you initially developed for your own internal development process. And along the way, it became clear that it can also be valuable for other Delphi developers, right?
That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So,
Okay,
and
so I'm going to give you the word to explain all the details about Runtime Toolkit and Marshal, Caddy, and Deputy that are included in it. While you're doing this presentation, I'll turn off my microphone and camera so that everyone can fully concentrate, focus on your presentation. Okay?
I appreciate it.
Okay.
So the objective of today's webinar is to educate you about Marshal. It's a resource that you use from day one without code changes, VCL or FMX, release or debug. And Joe found this quote important enough to remember, and I'm glad he did, because it applies directly to the challenge that Marshal was built to address. And the answer I needed is how to configure my components correctly. And switching to release mode means the IDE debugger is practically gone. And I came back to a central thought: what resource does a Delphi developer have in release? And the short answer is logging. And logging component properties requires adding a lot of log statements. And I did. I added a lot of log statements, but my fixes were not working. My logging was misleading me. I was executing logging at the wrong point, and I was just not getting the accurate root cause. So I noticed FNC UiPack included an object inspector. I put it in a tab and assigned my components. And when a component was not working correctly, I would fiddle with the properties till it did work. And ultimately, less frequently, I'd say this component does not work. And basically, I was teaching myself how to configure the components based on my app state. Now, this approach had one big problem, and it's: what did I change to get the components to work? And for me, root cause requires documentation and steps to reproduce, then you code a fix. And I realized I had an idea to share with Delphi developers. Code was already written, and TMS had a partner program. One of my mentors encouraged me, and I reached out to TMS. Bruno, as he said, thought the idea had value to the Delphi community. We agreed to be partners, and I launched Runtime Toolkit. So Marshal is an instrumentation SDK for VCL and FMX. And I divide the product into 4 phases. The first is discovery. And in this sense, Marshal understands a T application. It understands forms, data modules, and components. And it converts the relationship between owner and parent to provide developers a logical view. The second phase is transform, where Marshal executes transforms to assign inspectors by class type. And this is the first point of extension, which we'll see later in the demo. Ultimately, the inspect part is the visual UI. And what I did, I took the concept that you're already familiar with the object inspector in the IDE, and Marshal provides a specialized runtime inspector, Object Plus, using the TMS FNC UiPack components. And you can extend inspection by writing your own custom inspector, which we'll see later in the presentation. And the final part is documentation. And here's where Marshal helps you integrate feedback into your development process. So Marshal maintains a session that can be reviewed offline. The session holds change events and screenshots and allows you to set bookmarks to focus your review. And overall, I designed Marshal to be a very flexible integration into existing development. You can go straight from defect to code, meaning you're inspecting in Marshal and you're right away reflecting your change in Delphi, or you can go to a more formalized process where you're inspecting in Marshal, you're using Caddy to review the offline sessions and gather details to support a change request. Ultimately, you create your artifact for your change request, and then approved changes would be coded into Delphi. So it's flexible, you choose the way that you develop and how it can help you the most. So now that I've given a brief background, I ask that you engage with us through the scenarios, ask questions if the functionality is unclear, and please, feedback is very valuable to me in shaping the future product. Wait a minute, you didn't want to see that. Okay. Sorry, working with two monitors here. All right. So today's scenario, and you'll probably seen it in the blog post, is there's a dashboard reveal at 10 a.m. in the morning. I begin my setup at 9:35. A business partner comes to me with a request to change the title text on the chart. So we're going to see a prototype activity done with Marshal. The next thing we're going to do is fix a defect in the ETL process. ETL was running when we started the demo. We'll resolve that. And then we're going to enhance the bar chart a little bit with data labels. After that, we're going to do a code review of the custom inspector. We're going to review the Marshal implementation options, and then we're going to do an offline review in Caddy. And so with that, let's start the show. We're going to begin in VCL. And so here's our VCL dashboard. This is all FNC chart, FNC grid. So when I change platforms, I'll call it out because it's going to look very similar. FNC components look the same across both platforms. And here we have a chart with a very long title. We're going to change that because the business partner requested. I'm going to change that to a shorter title. We're going to do that by using Marshal. So the VCL demo has a Marshal button to implement the Marshal component. Marshal comes up in its own dedicated form so that you can dock it side by side. And you can work with your component on the left, your Marshal window, and your inspectors on the right. And the way we're going to begin this is I'm going to inspect the bar chart component. And I'm going to change the title by sliding down here to the title property. Okay, fine, we don't like the second monitor. It doesn't like it. So I'm going to edit the text of that title. I'm going to copy in the new text that we were given. bring back Marshal over here so that we can see change. It still doesn't like that second monitor. All right, so excuse the technical difficulty. We'll move on with the presentation. So I'm updated the text using the object inspector, but really I caused a defect because before this text was so long, now it's short. Really this title should be centered. And I'm going to use Marshal's Object Plus Inspector to center the title. The other noticeable defect is this text can be much longer or much larger. So I'm going to go ahead and change the font size as well. And I think an 18 font would look a lot better. And now we have something that looks a lot more like a dashboard. So with this, I've actually completed a prototyping exercise, technically online. I can get approval from my business partner to say, is this what you want the dashboard to look like? Approval online. And we have an accurate prototype at the end of that. So what Marshal allows you to do is to set bookmarks to make sure that you follow up in the offline space in Caddy. Bookmarks are annotation, they're a way to flag yourself in the offline world. And then you can make sure that you do your change offline. Now we've made a few changes through this chart, and we're going to go ahead and review them real quick as we review the Marshal navigation. Here on the left, this is an FNC tree view, and it starts with the application object. Below that are forms and components. And so the T application object gets its own tab over here. And under component tabs are inspector tabs. So then we have a few inspectors that apply to a T application. And then we had the component tab that we actually edited was the bar chart. And inside the bar chart, we have Object Plus, and we have an FNC chart editor, which we'll show later in the demo. And Object Plus should provide you that familiar feel that you're used to from the IDE. We have properties and events, just like we do in the IDE. So it should be familiar navigation, not learning anything new. Now, Marshal and Object Plus are integrated very tightly. Object Plus publishes events to a session, and the session is just a logical log of everything that has been done while we've been online inspecting. So first I changed the title text, then I changed the horizontal alignment, and then I ultimately changed the font size. And this way you know all three steps that you did to be able to recreate the change. And this is an FNC table view control, so when you click on it, you get more detail. And the way I provide that detail is by capturing screenshots before and after the change. And so you can look at them side by side. You can right-click and copy the images to clipboard so that if you need it to support a defect in your change process, you've got a little more detail to go. Other than that, that's the basics of Marshal. It's a very simple UI dedicated for us Delphi developers to be able to look at components at runtime. I'll read over here just to make sure that we don't have any questions. Looking good. So with that, we're going to exit the VCL demo. And we're going to pick up an FMX for the next piece. So the second goal that we have in this presentation is to resolve the missing data up here in this bar chart. And the reason I believe this data to be missing is I have data for 2019 in these bottom two charts. So it's reasonable that the data should have been loaded. And this implementation uses a Marshal coded implementation. So that means there's no button on the form, and you need ultimately a click handler to be able to start Marshal. So this is a fully coded implementation. It's the most flexible, but it is a little bit of code, and we'll go over that in the code review later in the session. So this is an FNC chart, and recently FNC chart started supporting data adapters. And I said, this is great. But I have a problem, and I suspect it is the data adapter. So let's validate the connection. So from the chart, the first connection point is the adapter property, and it is assigned to this adapter. A click on the adapter will take us to the component that is the adapter, and it is active. That's that's where it should be. We'll validate the data source is assigned, and it's DS sales bar chart. A click on that will show us, yes, the data source is enabled, and it has a data set assigned. So let's go check that. And the data set is a FireDAC query, and it is active. So there's no reason that my chart shouldn't be showing this data. And behind every FireDAC query is a T data set. So there's an inspector to look at data sets, and it's called dataset grid. So every T dataset descendant, which is quite a few things in the Delphi world, gets this inspector assigned in the transform phase. And what it reveals is that the data that was loaded to the FireDAC query is exactly what we see in the chart. So the adapter is doing what it should. The problem is the missing data in the query. And you can actually export this to CSV so that you can look at it later. Or if you need to analyze it in Excel, you've got your, ultimately here's your CSV of the same data ready to go for you. So the question now becomes, how do I fix that, or why is this data still not here? I'll go back to Object Plus, and I'll come down to the strings that are the SQL statement. I'm going to copy the SQL that's used to load this query, and then I'm actually going to use the applications connection by clicking on the connection object. And again, Marshal has an inspector for FireDAC connections called Query Tool, which lets you do just what the name implies, execute ad hoc queries. So now I'm going to run the SQL statement against the database, and 2019 data is there. So the logical conclusion of this activity is something happened in timing between when the query was loaded and when the ETL finished. And to fix that for our presentation, the only thing that we need to do is toggle the query to inactive and then active. And to little surprise, our data is there, just as it should be. So we've used Marshal this time to dig through a lot of components, validate that a lot of the properties are set correctly, and that the components that they are connected to are actually in the right state, in the sense that they are active or they are enabled, whatever the correct property is for that one. There's one other tool for FireDAC connections. That's the database browser. And this is a typical database browser, tables and views. Under the tables is the column type. The important thing here is this is the type that FireDAC sees the data as, not as it is in the database. And for me as a starting out developer, FireDAC's guessing of types can be very problematic. So seeing what FireDAC sees at runtime sometimes is absolutely invaluable. So that's Marshal data tools in a nutshell, and how you can use them to resolve a problem at runtime. And honestly, this one came up as I was building the demo. It looked much different at the time, and I'll be honest, I thought it was the chart adapter. I could have just put money on it, and I was wrong. Being able to see the T data set that was behind the query was what really led me to go back to my code and say, okay, what's executing out of order? And we'll see that defect later in the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and add another bookmark because we'll see them a little bit later in Caddy. And so the session for this one is very simple. We did one modification where we changed the active property to true to false, false to true, and then ultimately this bookmark will show up in Caddy. And with that, we have finished activity 2, and we'll get ready to move on to activity 3. If there are any questions, let's take a quick look. Okay. So then we'll go ahead and move on to part 3. And this is adding data labels to the chart. Now for this one, I'm going to use a different implementation of Marshal. We're still going to be in the FMX platform. This is called the App Inspector. And what you might notice is that it automatically started Marshal when I started the application. And it also restored the component that I was inspecting before. So the Marshal App Inspector is really meant for those times when you're iterating through development, and every time you're, number one, you want to see the form. And also if you're running between 4 and 5 components, it's very handy to have Marshal restore those tabs so that you don't have to go through the tree navigation to find each component. Because this demo is really small, there's not a very deep nesting of components. In a real application, this tree will be much deeper, much wider. So I'm going to fast forward this to the proper state. And then I'll dock the window. And we'll look at the FNC chart editor. And this is a custom inspector that I wrote for this presentation. Actually, all inspectors in Marshal are written as custom inspectors. It's a plugin framework. Object Plus derives the same classes that this FNC chart editor does, so all inspectors are plugins. So I just wrote one that is specific for the FNC chart class. And the reason why I wrote this is because FNC chart is a very complex component. There's a lot of settings, a lot of properties. It's so complex that you actually have your own editor for an FNC chart. So as a developer, it can save you a lot of time to be able to reuse these at runtime. And that's exactly the components you're provided with when you install FNC chart. The question is, do you have design space to put an editor button, or is it appropriate? If it's an executive dashboard, and that's kind of the scenario we're talking here, there may not be a really good place to put an edit button. So you want to be able to hide these things. And that's what you can do with a custom inspector, is give yourself the flexibility and utilize all the tools that you have at your disposal, as well as you can comment them out when you're doing a true release build, release to customers. You can just conditionally compile them out, and they'll never go to your customers. So in this activity, the bar chart up here uses crosshairs. And for me, I really love crosshairs. They're a perfect analyst tool, but they're not always the right tool for presentation. And I highlight that here in the data that's generated for December. So these two columns are so close together that the crosshairs overwrite themselves on the left side. And really, this would be better seen with data labels. It happens again over here in May. So these are, when a group is looking at this, we need some data labels. And that's very easy to do. Presumably, you've already built this chart using this editor, which is what you use at design time. So I'll just edit the series, the labels, and I'll go ahead and make them visible. Say apply, and say OK. OK, I've got data labels, but they are horribly overlapping because the value is formatted with a decimal point. And the quote that I came back to for this presentation is being able to use your resources as effectively as possible. Right below here is the chart that has the labels that I really want to use. So the only thing I'm going to do is come over to that chart. Again, it's an FNC chart. It gets the custom inspector. And I'm just going to copy out the formatting that's used in those labels. I don't have to remember the syntax. I'll just copy it to the clipboard. And here's an example of going back and forth between two components. You know, we want to keep it really simple. There's a dedicated component tab. And I'll go back through the series now, the labels, and I'll paste them in. And now when I make this full screen, this looks like a dashboard that I'm pretty happy to present, because each of the labels is then readable against the bars that they're under. And with that, I'll set one more bookmark so that we can review that offline. And before we go to start the review of the code for this custom inspector, I'm going to dig through just a few reasons why you might want to actually write a custom inspector. You saw me embed the editor and be able to call that at runtime. That's definitely key and essential. The other thing is, when you're dealing with just a chart, you do want to save an image of the chart, but you really don't need the whole form as I do in Object Plus. You're focused just on the chart. So a custom inspector allows you to save those images, you know, just of that component that you're really concerned with. Also, all FNC components are JSON serialization based. So you may want to see that JSON in a tree so that you can pick through the options that you changed, or you're curious about what are they at runtime. You know, here's another easy way to get through the options. And then logically you might want to save that JSON for later. So I put the JSON in a memo. It's, the whole idea behind a custom inspector would be give yourself the options. And I give myself the option to save it to a PDF. And this is included with FNC core, and it's a very low code implementation, and here I have a PDF of my components. So I practically have a defect artifact written just by having the custom inspector. And down at the bottom, I've automated the checks I did in the previous. Because we're using data adapters, I went ahead and automated the check of check the adapter active, check the data source, and check the data set. And while we know this one is configured correctly, I created an error condition over here in the spider chart. And so right away I have a visual representation that the adapter is active, but the data source is disabled. So technically, this spider chart is not really in the state that we want it to be. Possibly it is, depending on what you want the data source and the data set to be at status-wise. But usually that would be a defect. And either way, it helps for the inspector to point it out to you right away, because code never misses and humans do. Let me review my notes, make sure we covered everything. Okay, so we did cover everything. And so I'll ask you to keep in mind the layout here. The one thing I'll point out before we close out of this editor is these two toolbar buttons are not within the custom inspector. So when we go over to review the code, I'll show you how those are created. I'll look over here to see if we have any questions. Looks like everybody's still hanging in there. So a custom inspector, how hard is it? How much code am I going to have to write to create one? Well, this custom inspector is just an FMX frame. In VCL, it's a VCL frame. And it's fairly little components on the form. There's a list box here on the left to provide a navigation between the events that happen. In this page, there's an FNC image control. The second page is a tree view. And the third page is a memo, status across the bottom. And then the components that we used to do the chart editor dialog and the export to PDF. So very few components on the page. Let's take a look at the plumbing code that it takes to get Marshal to recognize the custom inspector. It starts with descending a transform class. And the transform class it's responsible for identifying what the class type is that this inspector applies to. So you identify the class type, and then when transforms are run, you essentially start a delayed creation pattern. So the transform gets executed and a tool gets added to the list. And so that's how it'll show up in the UI. And to delay that creation, you essentially descend a tool class, which is then later responsible for creating the visual components only when you actually click on the component to view it. So you add an instance of the tool class, you descend it, and it then creates a tool instance, which again you create a descendant of. And then ultimately the tool instance is responsible for supplying the inspector name and then initializing the inspector when it comes time to display the code. So here it is just a local variable. We're doing a frame create, giving it an owner. We're going to set its parent to be a tool area. And then the three steps that kind of really pass the reference over to the frame is this assign to editor. And then you have methods in the base class that allow you to add the toolbar buttons. And the toolbar buttons then just you implement the button events in the frame code. So the final thing that you have to do is add an initialization section, which ultimately adds this new transform that you created to the transform registry. So it's about 50 lines of code that you write to get Marshal to recognize that there's a new tool. It's not very much. And so now let's go over to the assign chart editor class. Hey, code navigation worked. And here's where we're actually passing the component reference to the frame. So it's going to get a reference to the chart component. It'll keep that in a local variable. It will assign the chart editor at the same time, clean up the navigation list, add an initial event, and run those three checks that check the adapter status. And then we'll go through the button event handlers. The show editor event handler just calls execute on the chart editor dialog and logs an action after it closes. Export PDF does really simple. It creates a file name based on the component, the class, the component name or the class name. And then it uses FNC util save file to ultimately implement a callback to export the PDF. And the PDF export is really just a few lines of code, very simple. You can review this off the GitHub. And then the status bar load is, again, it's very little code. It's a big series of nested if statements. Is the adapter assigned? Is it active? And then it goes through each of the branches of that, just to catch what you might miss as a human. So, and ultimately in the log chart action, I basically capture an image of the component and capture the JSON. And really what's a time saver here with FNC components is you have these properties for data integer and for data string. Every FNC component has those. If you've done FMX, you know that there's a string, a data string, a tag string property. FNC, it's great because it's in VCL, it's in FMX. Your code just goes from one platform to the other. So, and that's actually how I'm storing the event data here. I didn't even write a class to store those properties in. So I keep a reference to the image index, and then I keep the JSON string, which I just copy it from a string over to a string. And then the chart capture basically just stores the bitmap in a bitmap container and updates the image accordingly. So then when the list box gets clicked on, it's actually reading all of those values straight from the list box item. And it updates the bitmap with whatever the integer value from the container is for the bitmap, and then parses the JSON off the data string, or it loads the tree from the data string. So And if y'all missed out on this view JSON from text on the tree view, that's a blog post worth rereading. I should probably put it in the code comments here. One line to take a JSON all the way to a tree, nifty for sure. So let me just check for any questions. Okay, so with that, we've covered how to create a custom inspector. Now we'll go through the 3 implementations of Marshal that we saw in this demo. So we started the first one with a Marshal button. And to highlight that, I wrote these demos to use form inheritance so that we could isolate just the code for the Marshal button. So the component that's on the page is a Marshal button control. And the code behind it is practically none. The component is up here under the class, and to get it to recognize the plugin tool or the custom inspector that we wrote, one line in the uses clause that just executes the initialization section. So fairly simple. And then I added a form resize event just to make sure that the button would be visible. So button implementation is very easy as long as you have some design space. The third implementation that we saw in the demo, we'll go through it next, is the App Inspector implementation. And App Inspector is designed for when you want to automatically start Marshal every time that you run the application. And the main thing that it does is allows you to reopen inspectors. And that way it saves you time navigating between the inspectors, as well as you can disable the component to not show it on startup. So this is another flexible option for you want a component on the form. The only code that has to be written for this is, again, the line to initialize the custom inspector, and then you're going to want to give yourself an event handler in case you close the Marshal form. You're going to want to give yourself an event handler somewhere that you can use the Marshal API to show the window again. So App Inspector is a very easy implementation. And now we'll look at the more complex. So this is the Marshal coded implementation. And if you notice, there's nothing on the design surface. It's all done by code. And the way I did this one was I overrode the methods in the base form that are the spider legend click and the stack legend click. And now the good thing about this implementation is there is nothing in the interface uses section. There's nothing in the published components of the class. So everything is very easy to control using conditional compilation. If you don't want it in a certain build, it will not be there. And the way that you can, so it does require some entries in the implementation uses section, obviously for the Marshal API, for the plugin, for the custom inspector that we wrote. And then if you want to pass Marshal options, it needs one more entry, and those are here in the code. And then what happens is from the 2 legend click events, I call Marshal with some different options, one with options and one without. Both of these pass through a click counter. Just, you probably want to put a password if you're going to do this in a production app. Or at least expire your click count earlier than just going. And then you can see the rest. It just shows Marshal, or it shows Marshal with options. And we'll complete the last part. We'll show a quick offline review of what happens. So the Marshal records a session, and then Caddy picks up the session so that you can do it offline. This way you never forget what you changed. So here's actually what we did during this demo, and that is we changed the title, we changed the horizontal alignment, and then we changed the font size. The most important thing is in the offline world, I have a little more processing power, and Caddy does an image analysis. So it highlights, it runs it through Python to do an image analysis, highlights the changes, and you see them here in the red. And you can copy those images to clipboard. You can also remove the highlighting if you need to. So Caddy is basically everything that you did online, you can see it in the offline world. And ultimately, that's my goal with Runtime Toolkit, make it easy for you as a developer to be able to create your artifacts, for you to be able to troubleshoot components, and ultimately not forget what you did, because it's great to have an object inspector, but it's also practically a little dangerous, because if you forgot what you did, then the activity served no purpose, and you're not closer to your root cause, you're not closer to a fix. So for me, the session was the piece that I felt really had to get done, and we have to have a way to see these things offline. So, and with that, I see we're close to the hour, so I'll look for any questions. The one thing that is worth showing, and I'll do this just from one of my base. So, you know, this, I showed you a whole demo with FNC components. This works with straight VCL. This works with straight FMX. You don't need to be using any of those components. You need them for the Marshal form, but your application can be straight VCL, straight FMX, using Dev Express. Doesn't matter to me. The one thing that is a time saver that you should know is you have the ability to go to the active component in the tree. And I'll demonstrate this right here. So this edit box that I clicked in is actually it's actually in a frame that has a subframe nested in it. So right click and go to active can definitely save you some time, get you where you need to be in the tree. And that's the other goals of Marshal, is to give you what you need. And if you add a component at runtime, that's real easy. Just refresh the tree, and then I'll use go to active one more time, and there's my runtime component. So you're not stuck with just what's done at design time. You can use what you do at runtime just as easily, and all your tools are there for you. And I guess with that, we are close to the hour, so we'll go back to the presentation and go ahead and hand out a little special offer. So we appreciate y'all, number one, taking the time to visit with us today and learn what Marshal can do for you, and to say appreciation for spending your hour with us, or with me. I'm giving 20% off Runtime Toolkit using this discount code, and Bruno has agreed to do 20% off the FNC UI pack, which you need to be able to use Runtime Toolkit. So coupon for both, and you know, I do hope that you add it to your tool belt. I hope it's a worthwhile tool for you. If you have any questions about, will Marshal work with this? Will whatever your question is, you can reach out to me off the website. You can create an issue on GitHub. I'm pretty accessible. I'm also on Delphi Praxis quite often, so any of those avenues are great for me.
Neil, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was an excellent introduction to the runtime toolkit that you have been working on. I see some questions in the questions tab. One question is, what additional components have to be installed in the Delphi IDE? I guess that is in addition to the runtime toolkit that consists of Caddy and Marshal. Do you hear me, Neil? I see that. I think that Neil just got some connection issue. Let's see if he comes back. But well, I can answer this question for you. Well, as Neil showed and explained, the runtime toolkit is using the FNC components, and as such, the FNC UI pack would be required if you want to use the runtime toolkit in your Delphi applications. And as it is FNC, and that was actually the biggest motivation, of course, for Neil for using the FNC components, that is that with the FNC components, the Marshal tool can work immediately right in VCL applications, but at the same time can also work in FireMonkey applications. When an application is compiled with Marshal support, does it have any performance impact when the Marshal inspector is not shown? I'm waiting for Neil to come back and hopefully he can answer that question. But my insight here in this is that this has no performance impact as long as the inspector is not shown. There is actually no interaction with your code when the inspector is not shown. I see a question here. What is Neil's contact information? So that should be web@swiftexpat.com. Also, the website where you can find the contact information is www.swiftexpat.com. And you can reach Neil this way. Another question that I see here being made with FNC components, does Marshal work with web apps using TMS Web Core? As far as I know, this has not yet been tested, but of course, you're fully right that if this is built with FNC, at least everything in FNC is working in Web Core, so that part should work fine. But that's an interesting suggestion and something we'll definitely take up with Neil to see if we can make the runtime toolkit also a valuable tool for developing web applications with TMS Web Core. And it looks like Neil is not getting in anymore, not sure what happens on his side. But I'm going to conclude then if Neil is staying disconnected. Thank you very much for being here. I thought it was a very interesting webinar from another perspective, and that is from the perspective of Neil Laskowski. And I think it's admirable what an impressive toolkit he created in being a Delphi developer for like 5 to 6 years. And I'm happy to see Neil back. Neil, some connection issue or?
Yeah, isn't that just about right? At the end of the presentation, it cuts out, but that's okay. I'm glad.
Happy to have you back, Neil, because there were some questions that I tried to handle, not being sure if you would be able to connect again. So one of the questions was, is having Marshal with your application, is it having any performance impact when the inspector is not shown? My answer was no, but I would like to have you confirm that.
Yeah, the answer is no. Basically, it's all delayed creation. So until you click on Show Marshal or call it in code, Marshal doesn't even build any of its objects. Once Marshal is showing, it does heartbeat to to the session file that heartbeats once every 10 seconds. So we are competing for time on the main thread to a very little extent. And obviously, Marshal needs some time when it's showing on main thread to iterate the components and iterate the form. But most of that is very tuned, so you shouldn't see any performance when it's not showing. And even when it is showing, I avoid using timers to poll anything in your application so that the diagnostics can coexist while your application is behaving as normal as possible.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Neil, was as a large part of the runtime toolkit is created with the FNC components, and the fact that the FNC components work with web core, if the runtime toolkit would also work in an TMS web core web client application.
And the answer is it should. I've not had demand to look at that yet, but if you are interested in it, I can definitely, send me an email so I can put it on a roadmap and let you know when I think I could get there.
Okay. Neil, I also had a few questions that came up that I think could also be interesting for our attendees here in this webinar. We have seen now you demonstrating Marshal from a VCL and a FireMonkey application on the Windows platform. Would everything that you have shown, given that FMX can be targeted for macOS and Linux, would that also work when directly running this on a Mac or a Linux machine?
It works fine on Mac. Actually, all of the videos that we recorded for the blog series were done on a Mac. So, and it also works on Android. While it is a little bit hard to navigate on the phone because it's the exact same form, it does work on Android. Linux, I've not had anybody ask for it yet, so I haven't tried, but aside from a few rendering issues, the core technology is the same.
Okay. Another question that came up is a multi-form application. How would you set up a multi-form application to have the Marshal inspector capabilities in each of the forms in your multi-form application?
So Marshal will pick up all of the forms in your application. And I'll show that here. So this is Marshal running against Caddy, and Caddy actually has a form for the splash screen. It has a form that is the display, and it has a form for the icons. And so I built it basically multi-form aware. And what happens with multi-forms is when I'm executing screenshots, I'm executing against the list of forms. So you get a copy of each. It's not form specific. It'll look at your whole app at the same time.
But also when your form has not been created at runtime, will it show there, or is it only for the runtime created forms in the application?
No, you can actually refresh from the root. So for me, the root object is the T application, and you can actually execute refresh, and it'll pick up a runtime created form. As long as it's owned by the application. If the form is created with nil as the owner, then I have no way to discover that form.
Okay, great. And maybe another addition that I had while viewing your presentation was that I think it might be also a great tool to allow your end users or the beta testers or some QA department in the company to independently from the developer route back feedback or suggestions for changes to the developer to catch everything and send that back to the developer, right? Even up to a point, I think that you can hand over tasks like translating forms or adapting some look and feel, that you can hand that over to people specialized in other languages for translation, or people specialized in the more graphical layout things to fine tune these things, right?
Most definitely. Really, and that's why I have custom inspectors out there so that you can focus. I was a member of a data warehouse team who had 6 senior developers on it. And so if you want the power of a team like mine to work on this chart and really customize it to whatever they need for their group, custom inspector would be the way to go. We've given them basically the full chart editor without giving them access to the source code for the application. They can come in here and either translate it, tune it to what they want, tune it to what their whatever their business requirements are. And then at the end of when they're done with their changes, you give them a save to PDF, you give them a export to whatever format that you want it to come back to you in. That really is the focus of custom inspectors. It's partly for us, the developers, but also when you want to take this out to the business partner or the QA person and focus them on certain aspects of the application, that is your vehicle right there.
Excellent. My colleague Peter, who actually is the architect of the FNC framework, also added in the chat box links to recent written blog articles about SwiftExpat and FNC. So I think it's also worthwhile to check out our recent blog articles, because also these cover a lot of additional interesting information on FNC and SwiftExpat, the runtime toolkit. Neil, maybe you can bring up for everyone to not forget it, the slide where the discount codes are, so that anyone interested can pick up these discounts. So in the coupon code field on the order form, you either enter the webinar chart 20 for getting the discount on the runtime toolkit, and the TMS FNC SwiftExpat -1122 for the 20% discount on the FNC UI pack. And with that, Neil, I want to thank you very much for this informative presentation. I think indeed, as you mentioned, it is a very interesting additional tool for the Delphi developer, and I think you can get additional productivity having this tool in your tool belt. We look forward to future iterations, of course, of the runtime toolkit, and who knows, I think it would be very exciting to also see these things working in the web. I would personally think that would be quite exciting to do runtime inspection on components from a web browser. I've not seen something similar like that before, so it could be like a first if we have that in WebCore working as well.
Well,
Also, yes.
We are partners, so I think it's something for us to take as a takeaway, and we'll put some effort towards it. And I mean, I do feel, you know, everything should be as easy on an instrumentation standpoint. Everything should be as easy as a web browser. You hit F12, there's the developer tools, and ultimately that's where I want to go with Marshal for Delphi apps. So my answer is we'll definitely look at it.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. I also want to thank, of course, all the attendees here in the webinar. Thanks for taking your time and being here. And of course, feel free if anything comes up to contact either Neil or contact us, TMS Software, also with suggestions for future developments, things in connection with Runtime Toolkit and FNC, things in connection with Delphi development tools in general. We are here, we are listening, and we are looking forward to extend all the tools that are available for you as a Delphi developer. Thanks, Neil. Have a good day, and we'll see each other soon, and we'll, of course, continue to do all these exciting developments. Thanks, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thanks.